From CAFE and the Vox Media Podcast Network, this is the latest installment of the second weekly episode of the CAFE Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Elie Honig. Now, this week, we'll be focusing on Vice President Kamala Harris and her record as a prosecutor. Before she was the Vice President of the United States and before she was a U.S. Senator, she was the District Attorney for San Francisco, and then she was the Attorney General for the state of California, where she rose through the ranks to become the political figure we know today. I'm joined today by Marisa Lagos to break down the vice president's prosecutorial record and a few of her most notable cases and policies. Marisa is a correspondent for KQED's California Politics and Government Desk, and she co-hosts the weekly podcast Political Breakdown. She's a longtime political journalist, and she's covered California politics for the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Los Angeles Times. Marisa, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Can you just start off by walking us through sort of just the arc of Kamala Harris's career as a prosecutor?
You know, she became a line prosecutor back in 1990, pretty soon after graduating law school. She was in the Alameda County DA's office, which of course includes the city of Oakland, for I think about 8 years before coming over to the DA's office in San Francisco. She had a disagreement with the DA at the time, who she eventually ended up running against. And so for a bit, she went over to the city attorney office, which handles more civil litigation. And then she ran for DA in 2004 and held that position for 2 full terms before she was elected Attorney General of the state of California. And then, of course, went on to become a U.S. Senator and Vice President.
So just to clarify, when you say a line prosecutor, that's a phrase I use all the time. It's good to see. You know what you're talking about. A line prosecutor is essentially like what I was, someone who's doing trials and cases, not the boss, the worker bee. So important to note right off the bat, she did that for a long time, because sometimes you'll see someone running for AG or DA or even made U.S. attorney sometimes who's never actually prosecuted a case, but she was really an in-court prosecutor.
Absolutely. And as you know, probably better than me, you usually start with misdemeanors as a deputy district attorney. You work your way up to more serious cases. And indeed, she did handle, I think she's talked about handling sex crime cases, other types of really serious felonies as a deputy district attorney. And I think it does inform a lot of the way she kind of sees the world and talks about policy, really coming from this sort of survivor victim centric point of view on a lot of these things, including how she is trying to prosecute the case against her opponent in this race.
Yeah, she loves the line, which she says it became part of her stump speech. Then when I would meet with a victim, I would never ask them what political party they were, Democrat or Republican. Always struck me as a little odd. Nobody would ever ask that question. However, I get it. It's political rhetoric. It's good political rhetoric. But she said I would always ask them, how are you? Which is, again, I think a solid line. And that question I'm sure she did ask, as she said. There was an interesting moment when Harris was running either for DA or AG, I forget which one, where there became a little bit of a dispute about just how much experience she had, because some of her ads said that she had, quote, tried hundreds of serious felonies. And at a debate, her opponent said, I don't think that's true, and sort of put her on the spot. And the answer was she's tried around 50 cases, which is a ton. And it doesn't, to me, really matter if it's 50 or hundreds. But can you tell us about that little bit of a political dispute that broke out?
Yeah, I mean, I believe this was in the attorney general race against Steve Cooley, who was a decades-long district attorney and previously line prosecutor in Los Angeles. Very typical kind of tough on crime, I would say he sort of fit the mold of a 1990s prosecutor. And so I think he really spent a lot of that campaign trying to undercut her credentials, trying to really drive a wedge between her and law enforcement, or at least exploit a wedge that existed because some of her actions as district attorney. And I think that he was really just looking to kind of undercut her seriousness as a prosecutor. As you mentioned, 50 cases is a ton, and she spent 8 years as a DA. So even if she didn't try those cases, she oversaw likely hundreds of cases. But I think that kind of gets at the crux of a lot of what she faced early in her career, which is that she was seen by a lot in law enforcement as an outsider. She's a woman. She's a woman of color. She is not necessarily coming from the same backgrounds we traditionally saw. And I think that she really did have to spend a lot of time kind of convincing folks within the policing community, folks within the prosecutors community, that she was one of them. And I think that underscores some of the tension we've seen to this day about kind of how she frames herself. Like, is she a progressive or is she, a tough on crime prosecutor?
And I want to pick up right there in a moment. If she is elected president, she will be the first woman, the first Black woman, the first Indian American woman. Do you happen to know, was she the first female DA? Was she the first minority DA? And same question with AG of California.
Yeah.
Both first, all first. Yeah. And look, you are correct. And I can vouch to you and to our audience from firsthand experience. It's a tough job for a woman, a young woman, a woman of color. I mean, cops sometimes don't treat women the same as they treat men. Cops are overwhelmingly men. And I've talked to colleagues of mine, supervisors of mine, successors of mine in various supervisory roles, not at the level of state, well, close to the level of state AG, who have been women, and told them, like, look, the reality is they don't need me to tell them, but there can be obstacles that aren't there for a male. Okay. One other thing I want to sort of make sure we understand before we dig into this, because I am going to ask you where was she? Was she soft or was she tough? Was she too hard or too soft, which has been bandied about and reached different results over the years. But anytime you're looking at somebody who's running a large prosecutor's office, and that certainly could be the DA's office in San Francisco, obviously the AG's office in California. I was in charge of an office of 500 or so people in New Jersey. Your office is going to charge thousands upon thousands of cases. And so anyone who wants to grab the 10 worst or the 10 most extreme this way, or 20 that went bad or 30 that had bad results, you can do that all day, any day, to anybody who's ever been in any kind of supervisory prosecutorial position. So there's plenty to work with here both ways. In your estimation, though, Marisa, on the scale of 1 to 10, 1 being, your progressive prosecutors, your Larry Krasners in Philadelphia, and 10 being just, your Texas sheriff with the star on, kicking ass and taking names. Where does Kamala Harris fall? Where did she fall as a prosecutor?
Depending on the day and the era, I'd say a 4 to a 6.
Okay, middle.
I really do think she's pretty middle of the road.
How do you reach that conclusion?
Well, I think one thing you have to think about, and maybe this is going a little too far back, but it's just where she came from. Like we said, she's a woman of color, and her parents were big in the civil rights movement, but she kind of took a more traditional route. And I think that she really saw, specifically during her time, at a Black HBCU, that working within the system was going to be the way that she could make change. And so she did want to make change. So she's certainly not on the sort of typical tough on crime, Texas sheriff. She understood that maybe the way that things had been going, especially in California around criminal justice, was potentially too punitive and wasn't actually leading to good outcomes. But on the other hand, she was not one of these sort of lefty, what we call now a progressive prosecutors, who maybe question the kind of premise of the entire system. She coined this term smart on crime, or at least co-opted it when she was DA. She wrote an entire book about it. She instituted programs like Back on Track, which offered first-time offenders this kind of suite of services to really put their lives back on track and avoid a felony conviction if they could complete what they were offering. And the people she brought in to conduct that work, to work with these young men and women, were very much from the sort of reform community, if you want to call it that. They were people who had been working on the streets, who had been out in the community. And maybe some of them, like Latifah Simon, who's actually now running for Congress here, didn't believe in what, progressives would call the carceral state. So she brought in those voices, but then she also, I would say, listened very strongly to the people in her office who were line prosecutors, who had done the work. She had done it herself. And I'll just, say, to put a pin on that in her first race for district attorney in 2004, she ran as a moderate. She had the existing DA, the incumbent, on her left, Terrence Hallinan, very much more in the mold of what you would call a progressive prosecutor, although his critics would say he was just kind of a hot mess. The office was definitely in turmoil. Yeah. And then on her right, you had Bill Fazio, who was coming from a very traditional law enforcement background and was really running more tough on crime. And so, I think from the beginning, she staked out this middle ground, and I really do see a through line between that and her entire career.
It's so interesting to hear you say that, because, again, I was a prosecutor at various levels. I'm not comparing myself to her. She was a state AG. I never was that. But around the same time, I was a prosecutor from 04 to 18, which is almost exactly overlaps with her. And just reading back through her record, I don't come away. She reminds me of a lot of the good AGs and county prosecutors and U.S. attorneys who I worked with, which is not necessarily easy to pigeonhole. It's kind of an unfair question I asked you, 1 to 10. As you said, it varies. But those smart on crime initiatives were very popular. She doesn't strike me as someone, just from looking at a record, who was unduly permissive of criminal conduct. To the contrary, I think she could be appropriately tough when needed. She doesn't strike me as being overly punitive either. There's examples both ways. And the embrace of those types of programs that you just laid out was becoming very popular, not just in Democratic circles, by the way. I mean, I served under mostly Republican state AGs here in New Jersey. And that smart on crime was, I laughed for a second when you said she coined the phrase. I was like, she didn't coin it, because I was hearing it all the time out here. But you then said adopted it as a law. I don't know who coined it. I don't know that anybody did, but it was very popular and I think effective in that era.
Well, you bring up a really good point, which is I think we have such like political amnesia. But when a lot of the criminal justice reforms really started taking hold here in the late 2000s, I would say separate and apart from Kamala Harris, because she really stayed out of a lot of those political fights as a prosecutor. But at the time, you had folks like Grover Norquist, who was helping fund these types of initiatives, arguing that we were spending too much time, too much money and resources on locking people up.
The Koch brothers.
The Koch brothers. These were, right-wing sort of small government, libertarian-leaning folks who said, hey, we need to rethink this. And, let's not forget, Kamala Harris was district attorney and coming into the attorney general's office at a time when California's prisons were so overpopulated that the Supreme Court literally said, reduce the population or we're going to do it for you. And so a lot of, the kind of pressures that came out of that era that have resulted in what are now sort of controversial criminal justice reforms were really not coming from a kind of lefty space entirely. They were coming from a necessity after, we really threw the book at people in the 90s for things. I mean, I covered the 3 strikes debate here. There were literally people in prison for 25 to life who had a third strike of, a tiny amount of drug possession. And it was really a new time, an era of thinking. And I think that we have to remember that context when we talk about her career.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Okay, let's step back for a moment. Part of this is, I'm just curious, but you are uniquely situated to tell us, what is Kamala Harris really like? I mean, we see her out there on the campaign trail, and I think we get a sense, but you were covering her in her early days. So what's she like personally, but also what was she like as a manager of both the DA and the AG's office?
That's such an interesting question. I'm going to take the second part first, because as you know, I've never... that's not true. Not never. But the same way that it's really hard, as you said, to assess a DA or AG's record, if you look at individual cases, it's also just hard to assess it from a data perspective because so many plea deals happen and things outside of the kind of normal confines. On the other hand, I've yet to find a prosecutor's office where you don't have disgruntled prosecutors. Fair. Because it's a hard job and it's a difficult thing to manage. And you do have so many kind of competing things that are flying at you. And I think always resources are a challenge. I think that she gets a lot of credit for kind of righting the ship in the DA's office. When she came in, I'm pretty sure the DAs didn't even have access to email at work. Like the computers literally didn't work.
Sounds right.
So
yep.
I think a lot of her time in San Francisco was almost rebuilding what she thought her predecessor had kind of torn down. As Attorney General, I have not heard the people I've talked to the most around her as AG were more sort of in her cabinet, so to speak, the staff who are helping her on the political side or the more sort of pragmatic side. I have never really heard any complaints about her leadership as Attorney General. That is an office of thousands of prosecutors handling, probably tens of thousands of cases over the time she was there. And, there's definitely been some disaffected staff who have complained over the years about, is she, does she micromanage? Is she not engaged enough? I think that, one of the things I see as someone who's covered politicians for 2 decades, you learn a lot about people by like who sticks with them over time. And I will say that Kamala Harris has a lot of very loyal people who are still in her circle that, worked with her back in her first run for DA. I actually did an interview with a bunch of them at the Democratic convention this year, talking about her going out with her ironing board to canvas when she first started. So I think there's always going to be critics, but I think on balance, she's got a pretty good record. I think it's been a little more tough for her since she got to D.C. It's a very different animal running a Senate office or a VP office. But yeah, on balance, it's not as if there are these like widespread criticisms the way you do see, let's be honest, in, some of the quote unquote progressive prosecutors of this day, like George Gascon in LA, who's facing a very tough reelection fight.
Let me ask you what her relationships were like with two, I'll call them important but potentially difficult constituencies that a DA or an AG has to deal with: the cops and the defense bar. How did she get along? I mean, look, those are both entities that you have to work with and sometimes against, and can be, tough to please. Not that it's your job to please those two groups, but how did cops look at her and how did the defense bar look at her?
Such an interesting question. I would say for cops, you really have to go back to the early days of her as DA. When she got into office a few months in, after running on, this campaign where she was very openly against the death penalty, a young police officer was shot and killed by a gang member in the Baby...
This is Isaac Espinoza?
Yeah, shot and killed by a man named David Hill, a young man named David Hill. And it was just a really shocking and sort of senseless shooting. Was in plain clothes. He kind of called out to Hill, who turned around and had, I think, a big, jacket on with some very high-powered weapons underneath it. And it was clearly just a huge tragedy for the city of San Francisco and the entire Bay Area. She, before the funeral, I think a lot of sort of grieving and processing had even happened, came out and announced that she would not seek the death penalty. And that really poisoned, I think, the relationship with the police for a very long time. It's so interesting. The head of the union at the time, Gary Delanis, talked to me a few years ago for a story. And he kind of said in the same breath, like, it was the biggest mistake of her life. And there's no way a jury here would have ever convicted a death penalty case. So he didn't disagree that like the call might have been correct from a legal perspective, but I think it was a huge political stumble. And it really took her until she ran and won for attorney general to rebuild a lot of those relationships within the law enforcement community. I do think she made her case to a lot of people, and she was a lot more popular with law enforcement as attorney general. I mean, when it comes to the defense bar, San Francisco is unique. We have, I think, the only elected public defender in the state. Jeff Adachi held that role for a very long time until he passed away in the last decade. And he was a very sort of aggressive, more like a prosecutor in that sense, in the way that he advocated for his office and himself. And I would say that they had a sort of appropriately tense relationship. I think
it's a good way to put it. I like that.
Yeah. Like, I think on a personal level, they got along fine. I think he respected her. I think he did not see her as sort of going too far. But obviously, any public defender is going to have a lot of issues with the cases that are prosecuted, the decisions that are made on a kind of like line level. And I don't think that would be any different here. And certainly we saw that in her very brief 2019 run for president. A lot of people on the progressive left were very skeptical of Kamala Harris. They did see her as more aligned with law enforcement than with, their kind of causes. And I think that is something that, a line she's had to walk her whole life. And it's one that I think Trump continues to try to exploit in this campaign.
There's definitely a sweet spot as a prosecutor. If you hear defense counsel raving about how much they love the person, that's probably not a great sign. But if they despise the person, that's also not a good sign. So you need to be in that tense middle, I think, as you said. Speaking of her 2019 run, this is her run for the Democratic nomination, 2019 leading up to 2020. It's so interesting if you look back now at what the criticisms and defenses were of Kamala Harris then versus now. It's almost exactly flipped. There was an article run in, I believe, the New York Times by a law professor entitled "Kamala Harris was not a progressive prosecutor." And it's accusatory. It's supposed to be a negative piece against her, said she landed often on the wrong side of history. And then in response, somebody wrote, "Public defender, I worked with Kamala Harris. She was the most progressive DA in California." Again, that was intended to support Kamala Harris. Now you would just flip those two article headings. Are you surprised? I'll tip off where I am, and I've written about this. I've been surprised that her past as a prosecutor hasn't been a bigger factor in the 2024 election. In other words, I'm saying that with too many negatives, but I thought more would be made of her prosecutorial past, pro and con, than it has. What's your view of that?
you have to look at it sort of by the parties. I think on the left, Democrats who were very critical of her as AG for her lack of, say, standing up and pushing police accountability reforms, right? She did not sign on to a bill to make body cameras mandatory statewide. She did not sign on a bill to take away investigative powers from police agencies when their own officers shoot somebody. So at the time, I think there was a lot of consternation within the Democratic Party that she wasn't far enough left on these issues, especially in 2020, as we sort of, she was in the race prior to George Floyd. But I think that sense was really growing at the time. Look, all those people are very silent right now. They want to see Kamala Harris win. I talked to one former state lawmaker who is incredibly critical and a very big leader within the Black Caucus and on these police accountability measures. She just looked at me and laughed when I asked her for, if she was happy with everything Harris did. She's like, look at the other guy. I mean, I'm not going to talk smack at this point, right? So there's been a real coalescing, even among people that I think were not always happy with where she went on that. On the right, I totally agree with you. I am so surprised, given how much immigration has been a part of the Trump campaign, how much he campaigned on the sanctuary city policies in 2016. That was, of course, right after a horrific shooting, probably accidental, given all the facts that came out at trial, but by an undocumented immigrant of Kate Steinle here in San Francisco. That was a huge rallying cry for Trump in 2016. We have heard very little about sanctuary city policies. And again, I don't actually think these are fair attacks, because most of the cases that, have been laid out in more conservative media kind of trying to tie her to these are not things that the DA's office had anything to do with until this person committed whatever horrible crime they're accused of. But I do think that it is something that I would have thought that the Trump campaign would dig in more deeply on. Maybe it's just kind of what we talked about. It's complicated. These cases are hard to explain often. And it's not a kind of one-liner you can rattle off in one of these like rallies or a 30-second spot.
I completely was expecting Trump's campaign to look for their Willie Horton, right there. One example of the tens of thousands of cases that she worked or supervised, the most grisly example of somebody doing something after getting a low sentence or getting released or a plea deal or whatever. I mean, you give me anyone who's been a prosecutor or in charge of a prosecutor's office. I don't care if it's Archibald Cox or Preet Bharara or anybody. I will find 5 cases that look horrible for that person, even if the person was in a high supervisory role. And really, Trump's campaign has not been able. There've been a couple semi-half-hearted efforts, and they've certainly done it on the immigration issue, right? We Lake and Riley, we've heard about that, but not on the prosecutorial issue, which has come as a surprise to me as well. Marisa, we only have a couple minutes left. Have you spent time one-on-one interviewing Kamala Harris?
I have. Sorry, I never answered your question about what she's
like.
Yeah,
I mean, and you got to give us something good. Like, what does she like to eat? Like, what's her favorite? Give us some personal flavor.
Right. So I will say, I do think a lot of what you see on stage is pretty authentic. I think Kamala Harris, politics aside, is a very warm person. She's very, has very sort of strong, deep relationships with her family, her nieces, who we saw at the convention. She loves to cook. This is like not an act. This is a thing.
Listen, as somebody who cooks, I've seen the videos of her putting a meal together. I forget who it's with. It's with some celebrity.
With Mindy Kaling.
Maybe that's who it is. And I'm like, okay, you can tell, like, I'm not a great cook, but I cook a lot. And you can tell a faker. She's not a faker.
She's not a faker. There's been some really funny videos where she's like at some campaign event and gets sidetracked to like talk about basting a turkey or the best way. That's legit. Actually, one of my favorite stories that has not been sort of widely talked about is Debbie Meslow, a longtime advisor, was her press person when she was first DA, still, a surrogate for her in this campaign, talks about when she was running for attorney general and spending a lot of time in LA. It was Saturday and everything's very far away in LA because of traffic and just how giant it is. And there was some like random cooking show on, I don't know if it was FM or AM radio, but Kamala Harris would like call in and get recipe tips or give recipe tips. I don't think using her real name. I would love to hear that tape. And I'll just finally say, I really do believe, having watched her be a single person and then meet Doug Emhoff and fall in love with him. I mean, I think that relationship is very genuine and that she is very sort of tied to him and his family. And I know there's been talk on the right about her not being a biological mother. Lady loves babies. Let me just tell you, I took my then 5-month-old to the 2016 Democratic convention because it was either bring him or not go and cover it. And she saw us in the hotel lobby as she was walking in that first night, and she literally grabbed my baby and wouldn't let go. So my older kid's very jealous that one of them has a photo.
I was gonna say, how old is this former baby now?
8-year-old, and he has given me permission to go and cover Kamala Harris on the trail if I want to. He says that's okay.
So he knows that he has been held by somebody who a week or so from now could be the next president.
He does, and he essentially knows he has been used as a political prop, and no, but I do think that says something. I think that like the family stuff is very real. It's very central to her. And yeah, I have always found her very warm. I mean, I think she is a cautious person by nature. I think that her role in law enforcement as a Black woman in law enforcement, as a woman of color, has maybe made her more so. But I also just think that's part of kind of her DNA. I mean, again, you come from like sitting in a stroller at civil rights protests in Oakland and you decide to become a prosecutor. I mean, that's a choice that I think it requires a certain sort of personality and way of thinking about the world.
Yeah, that's a fascinating insight to her. And again, you were there first. You were there among the first covering her.
It's wild. It is wild to think if, she ends up behind that desk, And
whatever happens, the rise has been remarkable. I mean, I vaguely remember when she was California AG, I remember the name started to pop on the national level. But, how many people have been sort of branded as this is the next big one. This is the next fill in the blank, the next Obama, the next Clinton, the next whoever on the Democratic side, and don't surface. Well, she has made it very near the top. She's made it to the top of the Democratic Party. I'm trying to think now if she wins. So my prosecutor bias is showing. I'm trying to think of how many presidents have been prosecutors. I don't think Joe Biden ever was. Maybe he was very brief. I mean, he was a senator when he was 30. Trump, no. Obama, no. Bush, no. Clinton was the AG of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. So I guess that counts. Yeah, okay. All right. So you got to go back a ways.
All right. So dating back, 30 years here.
Anyway, Marisa, this was fantastic. Thank you for your perspective. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. We reserve the right to recall you to the stand after the election, either way, and follow up.
I'm always ready to raise my right hand. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Marisa.